Hi guys, Burkiboto Reasons. Um, Today I'm trying something a little bit different, but I'm doing so outside of the boat, by the side of the canal, with my feet in the water. It's the 20th of August 2026, and this is part three of my series. I thought it was going to be five. I think it's going to be more than that on consciousness. And I want to address the problem of what I see as sentience, that is awareness of some sort, a form of consciousness, and sapience, which is knowledge. Homo sapiens sapiens. I think the etymology of sapiens might be something to do with wisdom. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's really a question that's been raised in many different forums and contexts. And the philosopher Pete Singer, who is famous, quite rightly, for his exceptional work on looking at the rights of animals. If animals suffer pain, anxiety, or stress, ought they have some kind of moral consideration in the way that we treat them? But it goes much deeper than that. It goes into the question of what is called our tendency towards anthropomorphism, or to see everything through the eyes of human beings, and to treat human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, as exceptional. And there's quite a lot of people that I've met over the years who find this position of generalized human exceptionalism repugnant. Um, there was a guy I met when I first started fishing off of Erythpia, um, who was Irish and called himself Paddy. What can you say? What can you do? Who, I remember this well, even though it's about 25 years ago, gave quite a long peroration about how Homo sapiens sapiens were very much like viruses or bacteria, in that they colonize every space they possibly can and then end up destroying it. And his general position was that Gaia, Earth, the Mother Earth, would be better off if the human species just died. Now, I know many of you might believe that to be true too, but I don't. Uh, I didn't then, I don't now, and I'm going to explain a little bit why. But before I get stuck in, I want you to know that I'm very happy to take emails from people if you want to question, contest, or suggest other topics within the general themes and subjects that I'm addressing. And if you're minded to, do contact me. This is all lowercase at David Alexander Stone at outlook.com. David Alexander Stone at outlook.com. Anyway, when you look at other species and you ask yourself the question, are they conscious? You have to kind of like look at the vast array of different kinds of species. And whether you're a psychist who believes that there is a degree of consciousness at the core of all material things, a cosmic level of consciousness. Some who are disposed towards theology think that the consciousness is actually fully formed and superconscious, it's the divine. Others who are more materialist but still panpsychic think that there might be an element, a degree of consciousness in all matter, and it's just a combination of different levels of consciousness that contributes to the emergence of human consciousness. On this view, an ant will have consciousness, but so will the star-nosed mole, which, if you've seen pictures of it, and I urge you to Google it, is one of the most extraordinary creatures you can imagine. It's got a nose that looks like a hand. with little tentacles, and it uses it to feel its way underground. You'd have to give some consideration to my favourite of all creatures, which is the tardigrade. Again, I urge you to Google it. It is quite something. And it's famous or notorious for its survival abilities, and it's been found in the vacuum of space and in freezing cold temperatures. And it has this ability to kind of solidify its body and then come back into existence decades, sometimes hundreds of years after it was assumed to have died. Tardigrades, fantastic. But in terms of species, there are these quite extraordinary bacteriophages, which are like a virus-like organism that infect and destroy bacteria. But if you Google it, bacteriophages, they look like little lunar landing machines, robots, if you like. And you would, looking at them, you would, I think, not be forgiven for assuming some kind of intelligence there. There's this other organism, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's quite astonishing. You see it within the microbiome of human beings, which looks like it's walking and carrying a big ball on its shoulders, right? And there's millions of them inside the human body. And then there are the organisms that were at the foundation of living beings. Prokaryotes were simple, they're not even properly cellular organisms, but they eventually morphed into eukaryotes, more complex, through a process of symbiotic interaction where one is absorbed into the other and then starts to develop a multi-celled character that evolves over time. Do they have awareness? Now, organisms like viruses and bacteria will move towards sources of nourishment, and plant-based organisms with any photogenic qualities will move towards light or might move away from light depending on their constituent parts. But being aware of or responsive to your environment, does that count as being conscious? I don't think so. But you may differ. Come back to me if you do. So we move up the scale, as it were, from viruses, bacteria, single cell organisms to other species, which, if you again are minded to look at the characteristics of these various species, you will think they've got consciousness. Dogs, canines, that have been known to recognize an old owner decades after they've been separated. You've got pictures of chimpanzees that have been put out into the wild by their keepers, and 10 years later they recognize them and patently, joyfully greet their previous carers. You see pictures of ravens and crows using sticks to access food through a maze of pulleys that are presented before them, and it looks quite extraordinary. And then you see lots of rat-based experiments of rats and mice, again navigating their way through mazes and through layered devices in order to secure some kind of reward. Birds pressing buttons, and it goes on and on. Elephants never forget. The elephant's graveyard. These are all kind of like, I suppose, caricatures or stereotypes of non-Homo sapiens sapien that goes up the hierarchy. But whether or not an octopus which is it's supposed to have, I think, 3 brains, and it's supposed to be highly intelligent, though how you measure intelligence of an octopus when we find it difficult to measure our own. Elephants, octopus, primates, chimpanzees hunt in groups and kill other chimpanzees based upon a male-dominated hierarchy of the alpha male who controls the females. Alongside the bonobos, that are much more communal and collective and maternalistic. And it's very clear looking at either chimpanzees or gorillas or bonobos that they have feelings. A baby chimp who loses its mother is clearly seen to be, unless we are, as they say, anthropomorphizing, we're assigning human characteristics to animals, but it looks, to all intents and purposes, as if the baby chimp is grief-stricken. There's a YouTube video of a group of adult elephants rescuing a baby elephant who's falling into a pond or lake, using their legs and trunks and working collectively. They couldn't have done it on their own to kind of mobilize, harness, and then free the baby from its perilous situation. I don't know how you prove this, right? But dolphins are supposed to talk to each other. You know, some clever scientists have recorded the yuttering, nattering, squeaky, squawky sounds of dolphins and watched their behaviour and inferred from their observations that dolphins are actually talking to each other. And then you get the famous bees dancing to show where the honey is or the flowers are or where danger might be. You get ants signaling with chemical sprays when they're being threatened or at danger or at risk. They need to protect the queen. And whales as in the mammal whales, are supposed to sing and to be able to hear each other and to recognize the communication of the song from miles away underwater. And then up and up through the hierarchy to Homo sapiens sapien, forebears, Neanderthal and Denisovanian. And I think it is mute whether or not these species, these variegated species, have what we would call sentience in the human sense. I think they do quite clearly have a form of consciousness, but then we have to differentiate what I mean from consciousness to sapience. And I think the main and most decisive way of defining that is the move from consciousness to self-consciousness, and even to self-awareness of your self-awareness. That is to say, being aware that you're reflecting on your own awareness. A theory of mind, I suppose, is what we're talking about here. And there are experiments done with other species, you know, putting a dot on the face of a monkey and getting it to look in the mirror, and the monkey will see itself in the mirror and then put its hand up to touch the dot, recognizing itself. And the assumption is that it must have some semblance of self-awareness to do that. I have adopted a view which is not based upon any rigorous scientific ability or knowledge. I'm not an anthropomorphic scientist. You know, I don't study the correlations between human evolution and animal evolution. I'm not an archaeologist or a paleontologist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a very good philosopher. But it jumps out at me, the two things that jump out at me has been the defining or marking point of difference between Homo sapiens sapien and any other species are invention and culture. So when I put this to other people, they'll say, well, look at the reed warbler building its nest in the reeds, or the house martin building its nest made out of spit and mud under the eaves of a house. How more inventive could you be? The point I'm making is that they can't help doing that. They do what they do by dint of their biology. They don't have a choice. No other species could operate outside the environment in which it evolved. You don't get lions in the Antarctic snows. You don't get polar bears in the African savannah. But you do get human beings everywhere, in every part of the world and outside the world, under the sea, on the moon, in the International Space Station, and we've been on the moon. So we are not confined by our biology, and the measure of that is how inventive we are and how we create culture. Then the question would be, if that's sound, if that has some validity, whether or not any other species has an inventive side and whether any other species has created a culture. Now, for those of us who are conscious of, our biases and wanting to only find the evidence that meets our preferred conclusion, I find it extraordinarily difficult to believe that any other species, even Neanderthal or Devisonian, our predecessors, had cultures. There is evidence of burial practices and some evidence of the manufacture of very, very basic artifacts, maybe some very rudimentary tools, evidence of sharing of resources and setting around fires and using fires to cook and that kind of stuff. But that doesn't, for me, constitute a culture. The elements of the culture that I choose, and this is where I confess, this is where I am extraordinarily biased, is where a culture has a means of communication such that the participants in the culture can communicate about what's happened in the past, what's happening currently, and what's happening or could happen in the future. That could be a proto-language or pre-language. It could be symbolic. It could be gestural. It could be musical. It could be dance. It could be just the habits of the body. But I'm convinced, looking at the information to hand, that Homo sapiens sapiens, even prior to the advent of language, had a way of communicating about the past, the present, and the future. And that communication, or means of communication, was both the cause of and the effect of our ability to construct cultures, let alone all the multiplicity of ingenious devices that we've invented that weren't there, that didn't exist, things that did not exist that we have brought into existence. So in our journey into consciousness, which is part of our journey into who we are, which is part of the quest to find out if there's any alternative to the far right and a more progressive, enlightened future for our children and grandchildren, I've come to the view, and many of you are going to find this repugnant, that Homo sapiens sapiens are exceptional. It could be, and there's a whole program that used to be funded by the American Space Agency called SETI. I think it's now privately funded. heavily supported and sponsored by Carl Sagan before he died, that is looking at alien species. The assumption being that given the vastness of the cosmos, there must be a species which is at least equal to or not more intelligent than Homo sapiens sapiens. And I think there might be, but that's just a guess. And at the moment, there's no iota of evidence to suggest there is. There is just the statistical probability. If there were, the chances of us being able to communicate with them are so remote because of the distances involved. But you never know. If they're that intelligent and that advanced, they might have an advanced means of communication. They might be able to go down wormholes or whatever, construct the vehicle that will travel at the speed of light. You don't know. But that's all just those stories and guesswork. As far as we know, in terms of our knowledge, we are the only species that has ever and is very likely to be the only one that will ever have created cultures through our collective and communitarian efforts, through the use of tools, language and invention. And in that regard, I think we are exceptional. The danger is, of course, with any version of exceptionalism, is that you start to behave as if you had certain inalienable rights over other species, rights over the earth. And this was a kind of, I think, Blake idea when we started to develop a more empirical approach to our what was then called natural philosophy, which evolved into science. It was that we could effectively pillage, despoil, unpack, destroy the planet because we had mastery over it, given to us back in the day by God. So I am aware of the hubris, the arrogance that might attach to this idea of exceptionalism. I'll take an opposite point of view. For me, our exceptionalism, our inventiveness, our potential creativity puts more moral obligation on us to revert back to being more in tune with nature, because we are ourselves part of nature. Our exceptionalism is a product of our natural evolution. Anyway, that's it for now. This is part 3 of consciousness. In part 4, I'm going to start getting into the weeds around the nature of the hard problem. Qualia. Is my toothache the same as your toothache? Is my red the same as your red? Laters.